welcome most kindly to our second podcast of the Japan Startup Megaphone. Today we have another very excellent guest to really launch with. His name is Kenichiro Mogi. He's a neuroscientist, quite well known here in Japan. He's a writer and broadcaster who often appears on radio and TV. And we're going to talk to him about generalized issues regarding innovation in Japan, whether innovation is something different here or very much the same as it would be in other countries. We have a lot of interesting subtopics within that framework to talk about. First of all, we will talk about is the generalized Japanese approach to innovation different or the same from those that you might see in other countries, especially in the West, and how perhaps Japanese social values might impact the way that innovation is addressed. We'll talk a little bit about the Japanese concept of kaizen, which has to do with reforming, refining, and improvement of manufacturing and other processes. We'll talk about whether or not Japan might have a little bit of an edge when it comes to physical dexterity in the way that it produces products in sort of a workmanlike fashion. We'll also venture into other topics such as the roles of women going forward in Japan, and also resident foreigners and young people, where the country has had some difficulty moving beyond, how shall we say, the mores of the previous century. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the importance of education, which is something which Mr. Mogi very much thinks is the key going forward. Okay, well, thank you, Ken, for joining us today. We have, I think, an interesting second show for people. Now, you're quite well known, I think, here in Japan, but international audiences and probably most of the people who are listening to this will be from outside of Japan. Could you kind of give a little introduction to yourself, who you are, and what it is that you work on most of the time?
Hi, guys. I'm a neuroscientist, writer, and broadcaster based in Tokyo. I teach at universities, and I also a senior researcher at Sony Computer Science Laboratories, which is a fundamental research lab founded by Sony. I write nonfiction and fiction books, and I sometimes appear on Japanese radio and television. So that's what I am, basically. I studied the brain, yeah.
Well, actually, that's perfect because, although this is a podcast, you can't see it, but he just held up a model of the brain. And I've noticed in some of your recent videos, you've been demonstrating that brain. So
Yeah.
Can you kind of briefly tell us what kind of background you have in the science of the brain?
Oh, okay. I actually got my PhD in physics, and then I went on to study the brain from basically theoretical point of view. And my lifelong interest is to understand how consciousness arises from the neural activities in the brain. But meanwhile, I have written some papers on many interesting aspects of the brain, embodiment, memory, emotion, visual perception, and so on. But I also do a lot of popular science stuff. I write books which explain brain functions to people. And also in English, I wrote a book called The Little Book of Ikigai in the UK, or Awakening Your Ikigai in the United States. So Ikigai is the Japanese concept which explains how you can be motivated in your life, the purpose of your life, the reason you get up in the morning. So, you can ask me questions about Ikigai, but I guess this is not the time for that. I mean, you have something up in your sleeves, right? I mean, today, Mike. So.
Yes, and I have very ample sleeves to have
Okay.
them.
Okay.
So yes, well, of course, our topic for today is about innovation, and in particular, you do a lot of reflection on Japanese culture and and sometimes differences between the way that Japanese may perceive things and way that sort of, how should we say, generalized international audiences may perceive things. Are there differences between the way that Japanese culture and society approaches innovation compared to, say, the generalized Western approach?
Yeah, I think a really interesting point about Japanese style of innovation is how the society approaches the so-called disruptive innovation. Well, when you talk about disruptive innovation, you're talking about breaking the status quo and challenging the social norm and so on. But Japanese people are not good at that. For example, the Uber service has not entered the Japanese market in any serious way. The conventional taxi service still is dominant, and there is some, really strict regulations involving the government, and the government is not ready to relax the regulation in any significant way. The same goes for Airbnb. It hasn't really taken hold in Japanese market. So the Japanese, society is very resistant to this disruptive innovation, and I think Japanese economy has suffered a bit from that. Having said that, on the cultural front, Japan is actually very good at disrupting the status quo. You can probably mention manga and anime, which have been, relatively free from, politically correct or I don't know, preset ideas about human sexuality, ethics, and so on. In Japanese manga and anime, you do see really free-spirited expressions, which can sometimes cause problems, but at the same time provide a really interesting, new frontier for all the world to see. So, it's a real dichotomy that is existing in Japanese society. On one hand, the Japanese society is very resistant in changing systemic restrictions on how you do things, and that is a problem. On the other hand, on the cultural front, I think it is fair to say that Japan has, put out many interesting cultural memes, not only in manga and anime, but also in computer games and maybe other service industries involving human interactions. Maybe, Mike, you are aware of that since you're a resident of Japan, right? So that's my opinion, basically.
All right. Well, you have described something which I think many people would agree that Japan is more resistant to kind of a disruptive systemic change. But coming from you, somebody who's thought about many things, you've certainly kind of explored in your own mind, why is that the case? So could you kind of tell us, what deeper roots are there in Japanese society that cause it? I mean, for example, every society has an establishment. Every society has people on top who want to maintain the way things as they are now. So why is it in Japan getting past these barriers seems to be more difficult?
Mike, that is a really interesting question, and I think as far as typical Japanese people go, or well, actually that doesn't apply to me, but I think the number one priority is conformity. I'm not to cause any disruption in a given community. So no matter what your principles might be privately, you are not supposed to express it in public. In Japan, there is this famous expression, honne and tatemae. Honne refers to your true heart, and tatemae refers to the social self that you are supposed to put on the front, in front of people. So, Japanese people use this honne, true heart, and tatemae, social self, in a really, characteristically, very sophisticated way. So I think that's one of the reasons why the Japanese society has seen relatively little change in this era of artificial intelligence and information technology. Having said that, as you know, Mike, Japanese society does go through really rapid change when needs arise. For example, in the Meiji Restoration in 1867, the Tokugawa shogunate government was overthrown literally overnight without not so much resistance. So the samurai ruling class were, thrown out, and the emperor ruled Japan in a rapid process of modernization. So that happened. And second time that happened was after the Second World War, when General MacArthur came to Japan. Japanese people embraced the defeat and incorporated the new American system in a remarkably short period of time. So that happened. So as somebody living in Japan, I regard the Japanese society as an organic whole, which stays the same, more or less, for a long period of time. However, when something really drastic happens, it can change literally overnight. So it'll be really interesting to see if this drastic change would happen again in Japanese society. But typically, that kind of really rapid social change would happen only when situations become really, really dire, and people cannot put up with the status quo anymore.
Let me throw at you sort of one of my theories, which I've developed over my decades of living here.
Yeah.
And see to what degree you agree or disagree with it.
Okay.
I think that, in the Western experience coming out of the Roman Empire, one thing which shaped our cultures is sort of this monotheistic faith of Christianity and Judaism. And of course, Islam too was also part of that same world, where what was most important in people's in systems was people's values, or basically, what they believed was considered to be what was the most important. And so, if people's actions were taken in some ways that was considered to be value good, it would find a great degree of acceptance. Whereas Japanese society, there's much less of a concern about what anybody believes or what anybody thinks or what's in their heart of hearts. It's much more about what you do. It's your action and your behavior and the way that you act within the community. And so in a sense, it's sort of inside out from the way that Western culture has developed.
Yeah, I basically agree with you. And in Japan, I think there is tradition of not saying too much when you make actions, and those people who speak too much are not so respected in society. A typical example is the small wrestlers. When you listen to a small wrestler interview, he would never say anything substantial. He would just say, "Well, I did my best, and I told as the oyakata, the stable master told me to do," and all these insubstantial things. I mean, so it would appear from the interviews that the small wrestler wouldn't think anything deeply. However, once they retire, they speak like teenage girl. I mean, so all these times when they were active small wrestlers, they were thinking all these things, but they were not supposed to say things, out in public. The same thing can be said about politicians. Japanese politicians, whether it's the former prime minister, Shinzo Abe, was a current prime minister, Yoshihide Suga. They don't really state their case with many words in public. I mean, they are minimalist when they come to public speaking, which I think is a problem, but which also represents a long-held ethics in Japanese society. As you said, it doesn't really matter what you think. All that matters is how you behave. So this attitude has good sides and bad sides. And in discussing ways to reform society from the ground up. I think this lack of public dialogue, so to speak, like we are doing now, is a huge problem for Japanese society, as you observed.
Well, the one way in which Japan is greatly admired in terms of its innovation may not be in terms of the great disruptive concepts, but it is maybe in concepts like Kaizen, where processes or concepts that were originally developed somewhere overseas are imported in Japan and gradually modified, refined, improved, and brought to some of its highest forms by Japanese inventors. Can you speak to that? Do you think that this is something that Japan has done and will continue to do in the future?
I think so. And, Mike, you have just pointed out a really interesting strategic challenge for Japan. Because as you know, China's economy is growing. And, there are two superpowers right now, the United States and China. And Japan is uniquely positioned between these two nations. And although from, philosophical point of view, I think Japan is more aligned with the United States than with China. But traditionally, Japan has actually incorporated many Chinese cultures into Japan. And, well, for the lack of a better phrase, refined it. So some parts of Chinese culture were not accepted in Japan. And so, this refineries process has been really interesting. And now that China is rapidly becoming a superpower, I think many aspects of Chinese society, for example, the use of information technology to have access to the information regarding each individual's behavior. I mean, it's not something that you can endorse totally because it reminds you too much of 1984 or Brave New World, all these dystopian novels. But this way of organizing society might be an inspiration for a better management of society. So we do not have to incorporate all that is going on in China. But I think Japan is uniquely positioned compared to the United States or Australia or the European countries to, kind of cherry pick the better aspects of Chinese innovation and probably spread to the world from Tokyo. I think that's a great opportunity. And it's probably a Kaizen 2.0 or 3.0 in the 21st century.
Breaking in here for just a moment before we move to the second half of the interview. Just to note that you can find our daily coverage at Akihabara News. That's a webpage as well as most social media platforms. And also, if you want to see this podcast survive for the long term, please support us at our Patreon page, Shingetsu News Agency. That's Shingetsu News Agency. That's our mother company, and that's where we can get the resources to allow us to hire people and to allow us to move on into the 2020s. And now back to your regular program. In our inaugural episode, I discussed with a Chinese American who's here training software engineers,
Right.
and she pointed out that Japan kind of really missed the software revolution in the last decade or two. That whereas maybe in the late 1980s and 1990s, Japan was thought to have this great technological lead over the rest of the world. It missed, for example, the mobile phone revolution and many other things that happened in the software world. And she says that even now has quite a deficit in software education. But at the same time, when it comes to hardware, Japan is world class in terms of creating very delicate, very elaborate pieces of hardware in many segments. Do you think there is a cultural reason for this, or do you think that this is something that maybe 20 or 30 years from now may not be the case at all?
Well, Mike, that's a really interesting point. And when I discuss with researchers in artificial intelligence here in Japan, they point out that maybe it's difficult to, overcome those really huge technological giants like Google and Facebook, Amazon, and Apple. Probably it wouldn't be possible to do that. Not to mention the Chinese giants. But Japan probably has an edge on dexterity. When you think of the chef, sushi chef, I mean, he or she would treat fish in such a sophisticated way that nobody can match these artistry elsewhere in the world. The same goes for other parts of cuisine, and so many people regard Kyoto as the world's, gastronomical capital, and so there we do have this long tradition of regarding dexterity highly, and also respecting those people who work in these jobs. So I think that's definitely edge that Japan still has and would continue to have in the future. When I visit factories where they deal with semiconductors and they make chips, and for example, if you talk about smartphones, the optical devices in it are sometimes or often made in Japanese factories. And when you go there, you see how meticulously they are applying the speed of Kaizen to every step that they need for manufacturing, and which actually does not necessarily require a large scale critical thinking, like where the world is going to go, or which should we be an atheist or should we believe in God? All these things. I mean, all these great philosophical questions are not relevant when you are trying to make something in a very clever way. So I think there, I'm sure Japanese people do have edge and will probably continue to have edge in the future. So we should probably think of marrying this, strong point of Japanese society with, complementary input from the world, and probably this kind of conversation would be a really good leading point in that direction. So.
If you think about Japan's post-war miracle and the Showa era in general in Japan, it kind of has kind of a macho image even today, kind of the Yujiro Ishihara, tough guy thing. But at the same time, Japan, it's recognized by many people around the world that it really needs to unlock other segments of its population, including women, including resident foreigners, and maybe including all young people in Japan. How optimistic are you that this society is going to be able to sort of function on all cylinders, bringing in the resources that it really has here?
On an individual level, I'm really optimistic because I see students, male and female, really making progress in their own ways. And so, there are these uniquely talented people already there. And also the elder generation, I mean, 60-year-old, 70-year-old, nowadays, it's not rare to see those people heavily involved in information technology and really socially active in physical space and virtual space as well. So on individual levels, I think there are hope, but on the systemic level, I think great hindrance is, of course, politics. And the members of parliament are predominantly male, and it doesn't appear to be really soon when we have the first female prime minister. So we should really distinguish two levels. I mean, on the individual levels, I think the Japanese society is making progress. But on the systemic level, especially in politics, they are really stagnant, old boys in network. And I think we need to continue making noise. And as you mentioned, expatriates in Japan, I like yourself. I mean, they should have more say, and they should have more, you know, engagement in uh, social processes, including political process, I think. But you know, on the joking side, actually, people have been saying the first time heard that joke was maybe in the 1990s, where many people, some people suggested that we should have Mikhail Gorbachev as Japanese prime minister. Nowadays, people are joking that maybe we should have Donald Trump as Japanese prime minister, but I don't think that's a really good idea. But you know, so there are these ideas. So I think we should do that probably. You know, this we should welcome all these heterogeneous, you know, a spectrum of people in terms of gender, you know, age and ethnicity and language and also, but all into the you know mainstream of Japanese society. Only then probably we will be able to enter the new stage. So welcome on board, Michael.
Okay. And my final question for you
Yeah.
is, you know, right now, Japan is the #3 economy in the world. And it's generally known and its image around the world is quite a sophisticated country in terms of its technology, even though those of us who live here still deal with fax machines and things which make us wonder if that reputation is entirely earned. But but the but where do you see Japan in 15, 20, 30 years? Do you see it as one of the world's capitals of innovation? Will it still be, you know, a great power in this respect, or do you think that it's going to find kind of a middle niche somewhere lower down the totem pole in a sense?
I think the greatest challenge is education. You know, I see many talented young people that they waste their time away cramming for entrance exams. So, you know, but many friends of mine are actually opening new schools, and you know, these schools are based on um, contemporary models of learning, active learning, and investigative learning, and project-based learning, and also collaborative learning, where they stress the importance of team effort. And you know, so I think the real key is reforming Japanese education system, including the entrance exam system. So if we could do that, I'm sure the great human resources that are you know here would be tapped, and I think Japan can grow both in quantity and in quality, and Japan will probably keep being a really interesting and sophisticated country where many people would like to come, like you did. And you know, after this corona pandemic is over, I'm sure many people will come back to Japan. And this international input is also, you know, important. So I like really a person like you, Michael, to make noise about Japanese educational reform, because this is probably the number one priority. Like you know. This now defamed UK Prime Minister from Labour Party once said, "Education, education, and education." I think that should be the priority of Japan for the next couple of decades. So.
Well, that is extremely clear. Education, 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 and that's what
Yeah,
we'll
Tony
leave
Blair
our.
said that, and now he's, you know. But anyway.
Well, we'll leave that topic aside for another day and maybe another
Yeah.
podcast. But I do want to thank you very much for joining us today and to talking about innovation in Japan. It's always an honor to have you speak to us. So thank you very much.
And vice versa. Thank you for having me, Mike. Thank you.
Thank you to our audience out there around the world who have listened to this, which is the second episode of the Japan Startup Megaphone, a podcast offered by the Akihabara News service of the Shingetsu News Agency, our mother company. At any rate, As soon as I do have the next guest secured, we will be having the third episode on a Wednesday afternoon, Japan time. So thanks for joining us again, and stay safe out there.